I'm Nanette Levinson of the Department of Environment, Development, and Health at the School of International Service at American University, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our webinar today. Today's webinar, of course, focuses on our newest book, and you will meet all the characters very, very soon. I'd first like to start by thanking our SIS Office of Research, Emma Vitale, and our SIS Office of Events, Alice Peretti, for all of their wonderful support for this seminar. And I also wanted to thank our co-sponsors, the Internet Governance Lab, of which I am one of two faculty directors. You'll meet the other in just a moment. And then Georgetown Center for Digital Ethics and the Center for Internet and Society, headquartered in Paris, France, and sponsored by CNRS there. With that, I would like to really introduce now a wonderful longtime colleague and special collaborator on many projects with many of us and many combinations and permutations in this webinar room, Professor Derek Cogburn. Derek is the second faculty director of the Internet Governance Lab. And I should also mention, I, and Professor and Chair Laura DeNardis were together the founding directors of the Internet Governance Lab. So it's kind of nice to have this reunion here again today on this webinar. Derek also serves as the UNESCO Associate Chair for Transnational Challenges and Governance. He's the founding director of one of our oldest centers of excellence at American University, American University's Institute on Disability and Public Policy. He's co-chair of the Academic Network for the Center on AI, Artificial Intelligence, and Digital Policy, and many, many more leadership positions. But especially relevant for today and for this webinar is that Derek is the founder and the editor, the continuing editor of the Palgrave Macmillan book series, in which our book today is the newest entry for that series. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to thank Derek for serving as moderator today and to turn the microphone over to Derek Cogburn. Derek.
Thank you very much, Nanette. It is a pleasure to be here and to see everyone virtually, and to all of our future audiences who will be reviewing this webinar. We're happy to have you here. As Nanette said, we are delighted to welcome today this newest book in our series, Geopolitics at the Internet's Core. We're really excited in the series at Palgrave to have this featured as our newest book. And I'll put in the chat just a link to the books in the series, of which this one is one of the standouts in this series. So please join me, everyone, in congratulating our authors on the publication of this new book. We're really excited. So we want to thank the fact that we have all of our authors here today with us from the Washington, D.C. area, but also from the Paris, France area. So thank you, Francesca, for your very long day and joining us at the end of such a long day. We're delighted to have you. So let's get started. Our plan is to have about an hour of questions to our panelists and a discussion with our panelists, and then to have about 30 minutes of audience Q&A. So we do have a Q&A function built into the webinar. At any time, you can start to ask questions, and we'll queue those up, and we'll be able to ask those questions and get as many of them as possible asked to our panelists. So thank you for that. So the first question I'm planning to ask is to Fiona, and I'm going to ask Fiona about the preface. So first off, Fiona Alexander is a former government executive, thank you, Fiona, with extensive digital policy experience. She has served in the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, where she was the principal official for numerous analysis and development and execution of international internet, cyber, and communications policy within the executive branch of the United States government. She is Distinguished Policy Strategist in Residence at the School of International Service, a Distinguished Fellow at the Internet Governance Lab, and a strategic advisor to the Khan Cyber and Economic Security Institute, all at American University. Fiona is also a proud alumnus of American University and our School of International Service. So Fiona, Your preface is riveting. It is a first-person account of some of the challenges you faced while you were essentially running this internet policy for the United States. Could I enlist you to perhaps read the preface or a portion of the preface to give us that flavor?
Sure. Hi, Derek. And thanks for the invitation to present and this amazing opportunity and experience with all of my co-authors and to all the folks that are online listening. So I'm just going to read an excerpt of the preface that Derek mentioned. And this is in relation to the IANA function stewardship transition, which is covered in detail in the book. But the preface is about the last few months of that after the internet community had given the proposal to NTIA and our evaluation was underway. And after all of that was done, and after everything had been done globally, we had a couple of interesting months here in Washington, D.C., and the preface kind of addresses that. So I'll start. On September 30th, 2016, I found myself sitting in a courtroom in Texas as Judge George C. Hanks Jr. presided over a lawsuit brought by the attorneys generals of Arizona, Oklahoma, Nevada, and Texas attempting to stop the privatization. As I listened to the arguments being presented, nervously wondering if I would have to testify, I reflected on my time as an American University student and NTI intern when all of this had started. Pausing on the milestone moments in my nearly 20-year life at NTIA that followed, my first ITU Plenipotentiary Conference and subsequent ICANN meetings, the World Summit on the Information Society and the Internet Governance Forums, my first time at the Internet Engineering Task Force, the affirmation of commitments between NTI and ICANN, I couldn't help but mull over the fact that all the work by so many people all over the world now came down to the decision of a single man in a Galveston, Texas courtroom of half a dozen or so people. As Judge Hanks ruled to deny the plaintiff's application for declaratory and injunctive relief, I let out a big sigh. As soon as the gavel hit, I pulled out my phone and emailed back to NTIA 2 words: we won. The we, the global internet community, and the win, that our vision for an open, decentralized, participatory system reflecting the ideas of the internet founders had been validated for the technical coordination of the internet, including the internet protocol. On the drive back to the airport, my phone pinged nonstop. White House colleagues, past and present, internet governance friends from around the world, the chair of the IETF, the CEO of ICANN. I was unexpectedly conferenced into a public interest tech advocacy group's board meeting. Everyone wanted to confirm the outcome. Everyone wanted to celebrate our collective success, codifying a global and open internet. As my plane careened down the runway at Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C. that night, I reached for my phone. It was 11:59 p.m. After years of contentious debates and geopolitical conflict, millions of dollars spent on lobbying, and an epoch that was single-handedly responsible for drawing the world's attention to this thing called internet governance, the multi-stakeholder approach, and a little-known agency within the Commerce Department, how would we announce this achievement? A splashy press release? A conference? A White House pronouncement? No. At 2:01 a.m., 2 simple sentences on the NTI website appeared. The federal court in Galveston, Texas, denied the plaintiff's application for declaratory and injunctive relief. As of October 1, 2016, the IANA functions contract has expired. Arguably the world's largest internet policy debate to date had concluded. A great irony and a condition that speaks to the fragility of the internet and its governance was that a single U.S. federal judge would make a decision that was technologically complex and involving 20 years of work by thousands of people around the world within a day of being presented the case. And yet the internet still lives, and the internet protocol remains at the center of almost every geopolitical conflict in the digital world.
Thank you so much, Fiona. We are thrilled to be able to have such a personal account of your experiences to be shared in the book in this way. So thank you very much for that. So now I'd like to turn to Laura. And Laura, I'd like to talk to you about the politicization of the internet protocol. So as most of you know, Laura DeNardis is a global expert in cybersecurity and internet governance. She's a professor and endowed chair of technology, ethics, and society at Georgetown University, and also the director of the Center for Digital Ethics. Her last book, The Internet and Everything, Freedom and Security in a World with No Off Switch, was recognized as a Financial Times Top Technology Book of 2020. Among her 8 books, The Global War for Internet Governance is considered a definitive source for understanding cyber governance debates as well as solutions. Professor DeNardis is an affiliated fellow of the Yale Information Society Project, where she previously served as executive director and is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So Laura, this book is really about the Internet protocol, and at the center of the Internet, we have the Internet protocol as a geopolitical flashpoint. When you describe it as that, what do you mean, and why do you think this has occurred?
Thank you very much, Professor Cogburn, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll start with a story that we included in the first chapter, Derek. When Russia invaded Ukraine, immediately after that, Ukraine wrote a letter to 2 institutions that most people have never heard of. People on this webinar have heard of them, but most people hadn't, ICANN and RIPE NCC. And they were asking them to essentially disconnect Russia from the internet, in part by withdrawing IP addresses, Internet Protocol addresses. These institutions refused to do so, but they could have made a different decision. This wasn't the first time, as you know from Fiona's great preface, that internet addresses or the standards that structure them have landed in the middle of geopolitical debates, conflicts, issues. So just a few years earlier, there was a similar global concern about an anxiety even about China trying to reinvent the internet protocol or redesign the internet protocol. It was called New IP. There really was nothing concrete being proposed, but there still was a lot of discussion about it and great concern about the prospect of a new IP and of China's role in it. So what was that concern? That concern was who should have change control over such an important protocol? Who should control the technical architecture of the internet? That was the core question. So this control question really does have a long history. The move to transition years of American stewardship over critical internet resources that Fiona just mentioned is certainly part of this. That was a long planned transition. I remember at the end of the debates over that, a politician called it America's internet surrender. There was a lot of politicization of it. So rightly or wrongly, IP, the internet protocol, really has become entangled in every digital policy concern in modern society, from access, privacy, and economic competition to even content control. So it's become a flashpoint for all of these broader governance struggles. What's so interesting about this is that it really is one of the most nerdy, geeky areas of technology. We're all embroiled in that. It includes the IP addresses themselves, they're binary addresses. It includes the specifications. It includes the supporting systems that make all of this function, such as the domain name system, and then also the institutions that operate and regulate this area. So it does attract a lot of geopolitical attention. You can imagine why that is. It's arguably the most fundamental and central protocol that keeps the internet operational. So it plays an important part of the global economy, the public sphere, and everything else. And then on top of that, finally, it's also wrapped up in questions of who gets what resources, what kind of privacy they have while they're using these resources, and how systems such as the domain name system could be used for censorship and for content moderation. So you can understand the concern and influence and the geopolitics behind this.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Thanks for illustrating this flashpoint that is emerging around and has emerged around the Internet protocol. Let me ask a similar question to Nanette. Nanette, I want to talk about the phrase, the turn to infrastructure and Internet governance. But first, Nanette Levinson serves as a director in the Internet Governance Lab and professor at the School of International Service at American University. She is a past chair of the International Communications Section, the International Studies Association, and also the Information Technology and Politics Section in the American Political Science Association. She also served as the chair of the Global Internet Governance Academic Network, GigaNet, of which many of us are active members. Nanette was the recipient of awards, including those for Distinguished Scholarship, Outstanding Teaching and Program Development, and her research focuses on internet, cyber governance, knowledge transfer, and innovation. Professor Levinson received her bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees from Harvard University, and we're delighted to have her with us today. So, Nanette, this book in some ways is a longitudinal case study responding to our earlier book, The Turn to Infrastructure in Internet Governance. So when we talk about the turn to infrastructure in internet governance, there's theory related to what we mean by that. So what is the turn to infrastructure in internet governance? And what are some of the examples of how the internet protocol and its surrounding ecosystem have been swept up in this turn to infrastructure?
Thank you so much, Derek, for your good question and comments. And my answer actually builds on Laura DeNardis's earlier comments. And I should point out that Laura DeNardis actually coined the term the turn to infrastructure many years ago. Maybe I shouldn't say many years ago, a few years ago. we'll phrase it that way. And as you mentioned, Derek, we all together edited that book with the turn to infrastructure in its title. But Laura and Francesca in that book, I think it was the first chapter early on in that book, they highlighted how vital it is for us to understand the intersections and the interstices, these are my words, of the infrastructure with its ecosystem. And I think you heard in Laura's answer just a few minutes ago, some of those key entanglements. But I wanted to build on your question about theory, because one of the things that I think, and for me, that was so exciting about writing this book was the fact that each of us as co-authors, each of the four of us, brought a distinctive set of theoretical and practical lenses to the research puzzle surrounding the Internet Protocol in its geopolitical context. So we have two top-notch science technology studies scholars with Professors DeNardis and Muziani. Professor DeNardis also brings a background in engineering as well as in policy. Professor Muziani, in addition to her Science Technology Society and Studies background, brings tremendous expertise focusing on some very recent research relating to the Internet Protocol and China and Russia and other interesting experiments along the way longitudinally with competitors to the Internet Protocol. And Fiona Alexander brought an invaluable lens to our co-authorship team. As someone, and you heard in Derek's introduction of Fiona, who was actually there at almost possibly every single major meeting related to the development of the Internet Protocol and to the growth of internet governance, and a behind-the-scenes shaper as well, and an amazingly astute policy analyst. We each brought, and I have to add, I also brought, I guess, along with Professor DeNardis too, communication theory and interorganizational sociology and international relations lenses. So all of these together made for really vibrant co-authoring conversations and allowed us to illustrate the key entanglements of the Internet Protocol and its ecosystem in its geopolitical and geoeconomic context. And in fact, as Laura pointed out in her answer, we have chapters that actually highlight so many of these key research puzzles that link the Internet Protocol as a key player itself as it interacts with other dimensions. We talked about content, we talked about security. We also have a chapter on inclusion and many other chapters that highlight, using these theoretical lenses, hopefully key insights into the Internet Protocol in a geopolitical and geoeconomic context.
Thank you so much, Nanette. That interdisciplinary lens has been so important to helping to shed light on different aspects of this issue of geopolitics at the internet's core. Let's continue that interdisciplinary focus and turn to Francesca. Francesca, I know you're there in Paris. It's getting late for you, but we're happy to have you here. Francesca is a research professor at the National Center for Scientific Research, called CNRS, in France, and she directs their Center for Internet and Society. Professor Musiani has received numerous awards, including the recent Women Cyber Researcher Award from the French Circle of Women in Cybersecurity. Francesca, you've spent a lot of time thinking about how to deal with the Internet protocol and security entanglements. So perhaps you could highlight for us some of the geopolitical dimensions of the Internet protocol related to trust architecture, and provide perhaps an example of how these architectures might be taken advantage of by rogue elements.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Cogburn, Derek, and dear colleagues for having me. It's a pleasure. I think that in addition to the whole ecosystem surrounding the control of root infrastructure that has already been mentioned in the first person by Fiona and already in this seminar, I think that related to the trust and security aspects, there are two main things that we can mention. So the first is that the internet includes a whole trust architecture that vouches for things such as identity, authenticity, data integrity. And this trust architecture depends on a number of cryptographic key infrastructures and routing trust. So Border Gateway Protocol, GNSSEC, PKI, I will come back briefly to those in a second. So what we can retain for now is that states see all of these infrastructural pieces as strategic assets. So, for example, the US and the European Union support more in favor of a global decentralized certificates authority, for example, certificate authorities, for example, while the China Internet Network Information Center, for example, operates its own root certificate authority, tightly integrated with the state cybersecurity policies that are vast, wide-ranging, and fairly long-standing. And then there is a second aspect related to security standards and influence. So protocol standards such as TLS, GNSSEC, QUIC, and so on are debated in a number of standards organizations such as EHF and ITU, and competing geopolitical blocs attempt to influence the development of those standards towards their governance preferences. So Western privacy emphasis, for example, versus the Chinese new IP proposal that has already been mentioned, and we may come back to that, emphasizing control and traceability. So maybe I can give the example, as an example, the example of the Border Gateway Protocol and the routing trust. So the function of BGP is to secure interdomain routing between a number of autonomous systems, and it has no built-in authentication, which can lead to a number of hijacks, either accidental or deliberate redirections of internet traffic, and there have been a few case studies that were very enlightening in this regard. So the geopolitical implications of this are that rogue actors or state entities can reroute this traffic through their jurisdictions for surveillance or disruption. And for example, multiple BGP incidents, some were able to be traced back to Russian and Chinese autonomous systems in particular, have briefly redirected large volumes of US or European internet traffic at times. So the resource public key infrastructure was introduced to improve routing security, but again, who operates the root trust anchors that are currently the 5 regional internet registries has a number of geopolitical ramifications. And I may stop here for now, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you so much, Francesca. It is so important, and I want to thank you all for really focusing on the importance of engendering trust in the internet to continue the developments that are so important for all of us. I want to turn now to chapter 2 in the book here. So Fiona, chapter 2 is called A Radical Governance Innovation. And the first section is entitled The Internet Protocol as a Lens into Internet Governance. So when we talk about this idea of a radical governance innovation, we've talked a lot about multi-stakeholder internet governance. This is an area that I talked about in my book on transnational advocacy networks in the information society, focused on WSIS, talking about a lot of these multi-stakeholder governance processes. And for you, Fiona, there's a vision that multi-stakeholder internet governance is championed by democratic governments and often associated with an idealized vision of a free and open internet as opposed to an authoritarian version and cyber sovereignty approaches. So what would you say is the nature of multi-stakeholder internet governance, and what is the current state of multi-stakeholder internet governance?
Thanks, Derek, for the question. I think it's an interesting one, in particular as we're in the 20th anniversary year of WSIS, which makes me feel a little bit old. But I
All
will
of us.
say, at least from my perspective, and I think, when I was working on this in the US government and across multiple administrations, the thinking was that the idea of the multi-stakeholder model would have four basic kind of components. It would be bottom up, it would be open, it'd be participatory, and there'd be some aspect of shared decision making. And in the early days of these conversations, I should say, from my perspective, a lot of those original ideas, I think, reflect how the original Internet Protocol was developed, how the standards are made, open, bottom-up, participatory, shared decision making. So the idea is to develop policy, rules, and norms in that same spirit and in sort of the same ways of doing business. And I will say, in the early days of working on this, and we would try to explain this to people, and I would try to explain this to even new bosses, or we would try to explain it to the press as we were doing public events. People were like, "What's multi-stakeholder?" And I do remember one U.S. Major newspaper saying to us, "We're never printing the word multi-stakeholder," which they have now, of course, done since then. But at the time, it was like people were like, "What does this mean? Can't you describe it differently?" And we're pretty adamant. No, this is a very unique construct. We want to, describe it this way, and it means these things. And I do think, 20 years later, at least from my perspective and my work in this area, we've seen broader acceptance of the term. We've seen people use the term, and people don't stand up in the UN meeting and say, no, we don't support multi-stakeholder anymore in some cases. But what we now see, though, or at least I think what I find troubling, is a co-opting of the term. People like to say they're multi-stakeholder, and they might be, in the sense they let you in the room and they might let you have a statement, but they don't share decision making with you. So I think we have to be careful that there's not a single multi-stakeholder ethos that everyone shares, but we do need to be careful that when we use the term multi-stakeholder, we're actually referring to this aspect of having a shared decision-making process, and where people are actually able to participate in an equal footing, which is not what we see when we see different parts of the UN or other constructs or even other governments refer to the word multi-stakeholder, when in fact I think they're just referring to a consultative process that lets stakeholders have a say, but don't actually let them have a decision-making say.
Excellent, Fiona, thank you. And I will say, if you remember, the subtitle of my book is called Partners or Pawns, to really get at that question of real decision-making or just representation in the room. So, Laura, the book presents some interesting historical case studies about the ways in which the very design of the Internet Protocol has shaped public policy. And your first book was called Protocol Politics, such a wonderful name. So how is the design of protocols political?
Thank you, Professor Cogburn. I'll go right back to my doctoral dissertation advisor, Janet Abate, who wrote a book in 1999 called Inventing the Internet. And there's a wonderful line in that about how technical standards are politics by other means. And that really made an impression on me and helped me to learn about how architecture, and this is a basic STS concept in science and technology studies, about how technical architecture shapes society, and then society reciprocally shapes architecture. But what is it we're talking about? It's easy to have that theme when you're talking about something that's really tangible. But with technical standards or protocols, one of the challenges is that they're very abstract. So what exactly are we talking about? We're talking about the blueprints that enable devices made by different companies to have interoperability or to exchange information. So they structure everything that we do online. Some are household words now. It never used to be the case, but it is now. Like people recognize HTTPS or various compression standards like JPEG, MPEG, MP3, those kinds of things, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, maybe voice over the internet protocol, but there are hundreds upon hundreds of the standards necessary for the internet to work. So that's what we're talking about. They're designed by standard-setting institutions, most notably the Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF. There's the World Wide Web Consortium, but there are many others as well. So they are developed by technical communities, but they also set policy, in our opinion. For example, just a few examples that are not about the internet protocol. Encryption standards, they often mediate between competing values in society, such as individual privacy versus the ability of law enforcement or intelligence agencies to be able to inspect information and to enforce the law. A protocol like BitTorrent, it actually serves a very straightforward function of peer-to-peer file sharing, but it's linked societally to media piracy and related issues. And then an example from one of your many areas of expertise, Derek, standards that determine the extent of accessibility for the disabled online. These are just a few examples about how protocols are designed, or at least as they're designed, they can have direct social and political implications. So we decided in the book to describe 3 historical case studies. And the first one, which I remember well from the early 1990s, was the selection of TCP/IP, which is part of the Internet Protocol. And then the Internet Protocol is one specific protocol, but there are also a surrounding series of protocols that create interoperability. I'll just call them TCP/IP for now. That wasn't preordained, Derek. There was a competing effort known as OSI, or the Open Systems Interconnection Suite, and there were some other competitors too. So this was a titanic geopolitical battle. There were a lot of factors that went into that. The second one we go into is about the changes to the Internet Protocol over the years, and one of them, maybe the most notable one, is the development of what's called IPv6, which creates a larger internet address space so more people can connect. So this was necessary for the commercialization and the globalization of the internet, but it also was about access and inclusion and distributional equality and societally important issues. And then the last one we decided to do was the case of the privacy implications of some of the design choices around the IP ecosystem. So the design choices can also be about human rights. Taken together, these cases and many other ones that we mentioned that surround the Internet Protocol really establish, it's a long line of establishing. We have some of the scholars who have done that over the years on this webinar. I'm very happy to see them. Establishing the co-construction of politics and technology, as well as who makes the choices that help determine these kinds of rights.
Absolutely. And I think to think about who and how various organizations and societal components can engage in that political process. How do they participate in that process? How do they prepare for it and engage is something that's really important. So let's continue to talk a little bit about history and some of the historical aspects that are included in the book. So Francesca, if I can turn to you, can you comment a bit on some of the competitors in this process, especially French initiatives from the past and maybe even Chinese initiatives more recently, and why these other initiatives didn't necessarily stick?
Thank you, Derek. So indeed, I think that this is a quite fascinating and sometimes overlooked part of internet history, right? There are journals such as Internet Histories that place the plural of histories to the forefront, that do a remarkable job on unveiling these histories. But indeed, as Laura has mentioned with the OSI case, there has been a number of alternative networking infrastructures that have been competing at various points and still do. and that also contribute to like fuel the main point established by Laura earlier on, that is to say the complex relationship of co-construction between technological architectures, political and industrial choices. So indeed, there is an emblematic case of this that stemmed from France in the 70s, which was called Cyclades, which was developed by INRIA, which is the main institute for informatics and automation in France, still called that way, and precisely Louis Pouzan's team, which was a key innovation called the datagram model, so where packets were independent and the network was dumb, leaving reliability to the endpoints. And Cyclades actually directly inspired the TCP IP model, but politically and institutionally, France and Europe didn't back it long term. So there is a number of reasons why it failed politically. We had an organization called Poste, Telegraphe et Téléphone, which was the communications regulator at the time, that preferred centralized circuit switched models to maintain state control and billing simplicity. And so it backed another solution, namely Transpac. And the US, by contrast, had DARPA substantial funding for TCP/IP and the military university industry complex that supported it. So, technically, the concept of Cyclades was actually fairly close in quality, if not possibly better, to TCP/IP, but it was politically sidelined. So it is an instructive story in addition to the ISO push of OSI described by Laura earlier on. So there are more modern competing initiatives. One was mentioned earlier on, which is the new IP proposal that was pushed by, in particular, Huawei and the China Academy of Information and Communication Technology between 2019 and 2022, which was, so it was a proposal that was supposed to be designed for deterministic centrally managed networking with a number of features like built-in identity, network level control, stronger quality of service guarantees than the best effort that characterizes IP. And of course, it had a geopolitical logic behind it, the fact of supporting state sovereignty and control over network flows, and also this idea of challenging the decentralized internet architecture labeled as US-centric. So the reason why this particular proposal hasn't stuck has been, in addition to global opposition for a number of actors, a number of private internet actors and some Western nations, technical criticism when we got to the nitty-gritty of the technical characteristics of this, so and a number of political concerns about institutionalizing network-level censorship and state surveillance mechanisms. So actually, there are other future internet research frameworks. Some of them stem from the European Union, future internet architecture projects such as RENA, for example, which was endorsed by Louis Pouzan, the creator of Cyclades. And none has replaced IP so far in IP stacks.
Thank you, Francesca. I really appreciate you surfacing and highlighting some of these competitive initiatives, that this was a real contribution of the book. There were a number of aspects about the book that excited me, and Professor Levinson, I want to turn to you. The book has an entire chapter about the role of the Internet Protocol ecosystem in inclusion. So could you say a little bit more about inclusion? Because a lot of discussions around inclusion focus on broadband access, but this chapter goes into many other aspects of inclusion, including technical modes of inclusion. So do you have some examples from the world of the Internet Protocol related to inclusion?
Thank you, Derek. We really, I think all of us enjoyed working on this chapter because we saw it as a great opportunity. And we thought back to the early days when policymakers and scholars, when they talked about access, they were talking about access to the internet. So mainly access to computer terminals way back, access then to laptops, access to mobile phones, and as you mentioned now, access to broadband, a nice conglomeration of equipment and to the technologies themselves. And even as you will remember, Derek, Professor Ernest Wilson wrote a brilliant article and then built a book on it talking about digital divides and talking about divides that went beyond developing country, developed country divides to gender divides and social class divides. But as we know now, and from recent work, and there are scholars who've worked on this area, they don't work on internet governance per se, but they do work on what access really means and what inclusion really means. And scholars like Hargitay or Van Derzen or Van Dyke, they've said we have to go beyond the term access, which is just physical access to equipment or to a technology. But actually, what we have to think about is how individuals, how people use those technologies. They may have the access, but do they have the skills to actually utilize those technologies in order to get what we argue in the book is meaningful inclusion? And we say that to actually do that, we have to even go beyond the physical access or the skills necessary. But we also have to really assure that there is inclusion and what we call absorptive capacity, the ability to learn that actually relates to the Internet Protocol and its supporting systems. And I think earlier, Professor DeNardis, Professor Muziani, Professor Alexander all have highlighted aspects of the supporting systems of the Internet Protocol. But I'm just going to remind us in the book, in the chapter, we focus on, to begin with, domain names and IP addresses, not just access to it, but the skills to use it and the understanding of the interconnection between the infrastructure and all of its ecosystem. And part of the ecosystem, of course, are the myriad and very fragmented governance institutions. And we have a lot in the book about the governance institutions and inclusion or exclusion. And then we highlight the regional internet registries and standards organizations. And standards organizations have come up repeatedly so far in this webinar. Every one of those elements has a key potential for either inclusion or exclusion. So I'd like to maybe just focus in the interest of time on one of these. I'll pull out, because we've already highlighted it so much, I think, and so eloquently by my colleagues, standards organizations. So if you take a look at the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, on one level, we see it's open. It's open to all technical experts. But of course, you have to have the expertise to be involved. You also even have to have the funding and the support of either your government or your organization to be involved. But there's also a very important geopolitical layer that was alluded to in the answer we just heard from Professor Muziani when she talked about the role of China and promulgating a new internet protocol. They brought various standards to the IETF, where, of course, there's discussion, their consensus. They vote by consensus in terms of making their decisions, but it didn't work. But they needed everyone at that membership level of IETF. You needed to be at the table in order to decide whether those standards are going to be accepted or not. And for various individuals in developing countries, it's very difficult to be able to get to the table. And I'll just quickly mention that another civil society related to governance institutions, part of the ecosystem of the Internet Protocol, another civil society organization, the Internet Society, actually noticed a few years back that India had very few representatives at the IETF. And so it decided to craft, along with the Indian government, recognizing the political structure of India as a country and as a very large and emerging economy, they decided to develop a program to train experts from India so that they could then participate in the IETF. And that increased dramatically the number of participants from India at the IETF. And of course, as I just alluded to, the number of participants from China at the IETF today, that number has grown dramatically as well. And all of this has implications for inclusion or exclusion. But I also want to mention another thing that our chapter goes into, and that is much more detail about the IP supporting systems that have been alluded to already, the scaffolding of the Internet protocol. And I guess I'll mention one quick one that's been alluded to when we talked about routing systems. But there are, as many of you on the webinar know, Internet exchange points. For many years, countries and even continents did not have an internet exchange point within their country. And I think it was 2022 when Africa actually got not an internet exchange point, but servers, actual servers within the country. That's back to routing systems within the country. So there have been examples of invisible or almost invisible exclusion and inclusion. And what we try to do in the book is to make the Internet protocol and its supporting system and its ecosystem visible to the reader, so one can then understand how one can actually have a voice, how one can actually be included in many of the key decisions, and in many of the parts of the ecosystem that are, as Fiona explained earlier, multi-stakeholder in nature.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Levinson. And I really appreciated the fact that this chapter was in the book and that you, as the authors, really covered this issue with such careful attention. So Fiona, I want to return to you. So when we talk about politics, and particularly geopolitics, we are often talking about power. And at the root of politics is really about power. And so on page 202 in the book, there's a section that starts off saying the technological artifact that is the IP address in design uses supportive systems and governance, and it elucidates 8 points of control and power that help explain why IP resides at the center of so many of these controversies. So that's on page 202 in the book. So Fiona, if we think about this chapter, which I think is one of the most useful contributions, particularly this table, this chart that summarizes these 8 points of power, can you say a little bit about what you mean by these 8 points of power and how they explain the geopolitical attention that the Internet protocol attracts?
Sure, thank you. Happy to try to answer that a little bit. So, as Dr. Cogburn has said in this chapter, we sort of put forward a framework where there's 8 particular points in the design and use and supporting systems and the governance of the Internet protocol itself, where we believe that power can be attempted to be exerted or influenced. And these are the 8 that we put forward. The first is the architectural design. So this is the authority over designing of the protocols. And this gets to some of the standards making institutions that Dr. Levinson was just speaking about most recently. Then there's the distributional forces. So this is who gets to actually decide who gives out internet addresses. We talked a little bit about the regional internet registries in the session so far, and that's kind of the place around the distributional forces. Then there's the possessorship, or who actually gets to use or acquires these resources. Then there's the intermediation power. This is power via co-opting or otherwise using IP infrastructure for content, disrupting communication, surveillance. So this gets to some of the issue sets that we cover in the chapters on security and content control. Then there's the recognition that the internet is global in nature and doesn't really recognize nation-state borders. So there's an extraterritoriality component to power that can be used here. Then there's the issues around security and the security decision designs. Then we have issues around forces of identification. So this is decisions about anonymity, personal identity, authentication, and traceability. And then lastly, the politics of structuralization. And this is the power dynamics behind attempts to procedurally or institutionally shape or reconfigure the governance systems. And each of the different chapters in the book leading up to this last one covers at some level one of these 8 points of power that I've just laid out.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Fiona. This is, as I mentioned, one of my favorite aspects of the book. And I think that this framework will be used for analysis now and into the future. I know I will be using it. I like it a lot. And so I encourage everyone to take a look at that. So Professor DeNardis, the last chapter of the book gets into the future of the internet and some emerging technologies. Will you mention some of these emerging technologies, and maybe even if you're up to it, maybe read the last paragraph of the book?
Certainly. Thank you very much. This was one of the most fun chapters to write because we conducted interviews with experts from around the world, and it was very interesting to see what some of the early pioneers of the internet thought would be the technical and political futures of the internet. So it was very, very interesting. Now, over time, the internet protocol has endured and even helped propel emerging technologies that now we don't think of as emerging technologies anymore. It's important to note that the web was once an emerging technology. Social media was once an emerging technology, and smartphones. And now I would include AI in that. Some of it is emerging, but some has been around for a very long time. And just a few notes on that, Professor Cogburn. AI would not be usable without the internet. The internet's infrastructure, from cloud computing to broadband access, content hosting services, it's the scaffolding of AI. But reciprocally, AI is diffused everywhere in the architecture of the internet at all layers. These are very, very entangled, especially cybersecurity, but also search engines, traffic management, network management of all sorts. So where will this go? The way we described it in the book is that IP will continue moving into infinitesimally small spaces and also astronomically large spaces. So it's leaping from two-dimensional screens to 3D physical and biological space. Some of these are, of course, the ongoing evolution of the IoT, or the Internet of Things, even cyber brain interfaces, haptic technologies that are based on IP that touch the body and exert pressure on the body, quantum internet entanglements, and of course, something that I've been very interested in is the solar system internet, to bring the internet up into the solar system, far beyond the moon. So one thing these all have in common, what do they all have in common? They have nothing to do with what you do through a screen. It's about the internet diffusing into the physical world, from objects to the brain and into deep space. So it's not too early to address any of these. If history is any indication, this all moves very quickly. Web browsers date back to when, maybe the early 1990s, when there was still no Facebook, no TikTok, no Google, no smartphones, no streaming video. It moves very, very quickly. So we're going to be interested in watching that as it moves further into smaller spaces and larger spaces. I think we'll all be alive to see this evolution. So it's happening quickly, and I'm going to take Dr. Cogburn's charge of reading the last paragraph. The societal stakes of the Internet protocol ecosystem will only increase as digital and possibly quantum networks embed further into humans, objects, financial systems, medicine, the Earth, and into the solar system. Massive technological change will continue, from AI to neuroscience and biotech interfaces not yet envisioned. If history is any indication, the rising stakes of these new applications will be accompanied by ongoing geopolitical struggles and crises. Indeed, they have already begun. And yet the internet continues with IP at its core. The end.
Bravo. Thank you very much for that. And I just wanted to double down as well, Professor DeNardis, on the idea that AI in its current form wouldn't be possible without the internet. If we think about how the internet was scraped and data was used to train the large language models that are behind generative AI, it wouldn't be here without that capability. So I'm so glad you highlighted that. We'd like to turn to audience questions now. So if audience members, there's a Q&A button at the bottom. If you'll click that, and we'd love to answer your questions. To get you started, I'm going to ask one more while you populate your questions. And I'm going to ask this question to Professor Denard. Professor Levinson. So Professor Levinson, the writing process for this project was somewhat unusual and lengthy, and it used multiple authors, both scholars as well as practitioners, and several different research methods. Professor Denard has just mentioned the interviews. So what was the writing process like for this particular project?
Thank you very much, Derek. I've been reflecting on it. It was one of the most extraordinary experiences of my academic life. I went back to look at emails. We have been working on this for about 4 years. And when I say working on this, it's a very special and distinctive way of authoring. We would meet almost every single week, rain or shine on both sides of the continent, two continents, some breaks in the summer, but very, very little. Great debate, dialogue. You heard in my earlier answer the various lenses that we brought. You also heard that we used an interview or surveys of select experts as we wrote this book, because we were very interested also. We realized, and I think you all realized from listening to this webinar, that the Internet Protocol has really stuck. This is a longitudinal case study. And one of the questions that we thought would be very interesting, not just to get our own opinion and bringing our own theoretical lenses, but to get the ideas of practitioners and experts and scholars from around the world, a select group. So we actually incorporated that feedback, and I think you'll find that especially also in one of my favorite chapters of the book, the very last chapter of the book. So in sum, we spanned 2 continents. You can see that we cover many generations, but one of the things that we do have in common is that most of us have been at least definitely at the very beginning of what we might call internet governance today, and that goes way back. And some have joined a little bit more recently, but still have a very strong history in the field of internet governance. And having this longitudinal perspective, I think, really assisted us in asking critical questions of ourselves. So we debated among ourselves. We would rewrite sentences, paragraphs. We used various mini cases in each chapter. And we even debated about which examples we wanted to use to bring to life the concepts that we were discussing in each one of our chapters. So for me, it was an absolutely extraordinary experience, and I will long remember all of my wonderful co-authors in this book.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. Seeing that geographically distributed writing process come to light is so interesting, and I appreciate that. I'm going to ask Alice to help me out here. Alice, something seems to be going wrong with my interface, and I'm not able to chat or to access any of the questions. So if there are questions coming in, could you ask them for me while I maybe update my system? I'm just getting a beach ball right now. So Alice, could you do that for me? Would you mind?
And while Alice is doing that, Derek, I noticed that Francesca had her hand up. I don't know.
I missed that. Francesca, please.
Don't worry, it was to bring a compliment to the writing process answer.
Please share.
I think that one more component of the writing process that is more unusual for us academics than than just collaborating among us was indeed to have Fiona on board, because it both brought unique insights from her own experience. It was almost like to have a permanent interview of fieldwork interview with a fourth co-author, which indeed was wonderful. And at the same time, I think that we all appreciate the challenge of writing a book that brings both research and practice together, and to merge the two so that they bring together a coherent yet complex story. It has to be because of the complex subject. And so I just wanted to highlight the the extent to which I really appreciated this long-term writing experience with Fiona as a notable practitioner in the field.
Excellent. I agree. This was a wonderful treat to see this unfold. So Fiona, I think they're giving you rounds of applause there. So thank you for joining this project. My system is still going a little haywire. It keeps changing. Fiona, Francesca's hand finally popped up, so something's happening on my side. But we'll get through this. Alice is telling me that there are not yet any questions. So there's such wonderful people in the audience. I'd love to see some questions. We see people that we know all over the world who are joining us. I see some wonderful names there. So please do, if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A at the bottom. And Alice, if you'll let me know when they come in. I thought it was because I was having problems, but I am able to click now, so I can see. So in the meantime, let me ask a few more, but we would love to have some audience questions. So first off, I want to pick up on, Francesca, what you just said, and sort of building on the last question. So all of us have been very active in these spaces, and we've seen Fiona in action, in Geneva and Istanbul and every place around the world. Can you say a little bit about your role as academics and researchers and scholars in this space? We know we have our Global Internet Governance Academic Network as one place where many of us help to create GigaNet, and it's a wonderful space for us to be able to present our work. But as academics working in this geopolitical space, would anybody like to just say how that feels for you? What has that experience been like? Any of you? Yep. Nanette, you want to go first?
Thank you, Derek. Actually, it's something I've reflected on a great deal. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years is there are actually two types or subtypes, and maybe this is just too broad or too general, of academics. So there are academics such as myself who find it very valuable to be physically present at these events, but not to actually shape those events directly. If I'm studying, for example, that particular event. And equally powerful are at what I call activist academics, who not only study something, but they actually are physically there advocating for a particular point of view. And I think both of those things are very rich and really add to that tapestry metaphor that I talked about earlier. And I would love to hear some of my colleagues' comments on that. But for me, it's been invaluable. And I know I will quickly reflect back with you, Derek, because Derek and I were both in Athens in 2006 at the first Internet Governance Forum. And yes, we could have studied it from afar, but we would not have observed. We need rich contextual detail. The incredible first moments of that meeting, where members of nation-state delegations entered the room and they were looking for their assigned locations, and they were expecting members of civil society to be sitting way off on the periphery, on the side or the back of the room, and not having access to the microphones. And instead, it was a bit disorienting for all of us because we got to sit wherever we came in. We were early, so we sat either the front row or the second row. I can't remember. We were very close to the front. It was a tremendous experience and a very empowering experience, I think, for civil society, and academics are, of course, a part of civil society, or usually considered a part of civil society.
Yes.
But I'd love to hear my colleagues' comments on this as well.
So I want to do another pitch here. I've got lots of books on my desk here. So I want to pitch our other book, Researching Internet Governance, Methods, Frameworks, and Futures. So this is another book that talks a lot about the different methods and approaches to studying internet governance and some of the challenges and thinking about epistemic communities, but also some of the methods that are out there, both traditional and non-traditional. Professor DeNardis, would you like to say a little bit about that research process?
Absolutely, and thank you for mentioning our book, Dr. Cogburn. And just want to mention that I believe it's still available open access online so
It
that
is.
students can use it, doctoral students, masters, undergrad, and just internet governance researchers in general. So I'm very happy and also appreciative to the contributors that weighed in on that book. But I've had a very good experience as a scholar being in the room in a number of different ways. And I wanted to enter that topic by saying that as we all have developed in our work, when we say internet governance, it's not just about being around the governments. It's also being in the technical standards communities, the technical coordinating committees, involved and engaged in the private sector, and doing all of this on a global scale. And some of the experiences that I've had that have been very informative to my own work include being a member of the Global Commission on Internet Governance for 2 years and working with 25 people from around the world. It was chaired by the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, but it had a number of people on it. And through that, we commissioned 50 research papers and conducted a survey of thousands of people around the world. It was part of the research. So having that in being involved with the politicians on that, it was part of research. Another good experience is being a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And as part of that, I was on a special working group on American space security. And I learned a tremendous amount from being in the room with people from NASA to former high-level politicians. And it's a wonderful, wonderful experience. And then one example from the technical side, I guess I would have to say, working with the Internet Society's special interest group on the solar system internet, and working with everyone from Windsurf to NASA engineers and people from JAXA in Japan on solar system internet architecture and governance. So I view all of this as part of research and us learning from each other.
Excellent, excellent. Professor Musiani, and we are starting to get some questions in now, but I want to continue this line for just a second. So Professor Musiani, you have been a sociologist in the French Cybersecurity Agency. Can you say a little bit about what that experience was like as an academic in that space?
Yes, thank you. Actually, it's more precisely about being an academic from the social sciences in that space, in that the Cybersecurity Agency in France, ANSSI, is to a very large extent a predominantly technical agency. So I was brought in the latest instance of the Scientific Council there to try and work on the human factor in cybersecurity, and like to actually even before bringing in like my own research on the subject, it was about making employees of the French Cybersecurity Agency aware that there was a whole span of research being done from sociology to psychology to law. To economy about the social aspects of cybersecurity, broadly speaking. And so I ended up organizing several meetings for agents of ANSSI, and it has been a rewarding and pretty challenging experience, but I'm happy to say that I think that this is like the idea that there are human and social factors in cybersecurity alongside the technical ones is really taking hold and increasing. So I know that there are places in the world where this is more developed. Canada and the UK have done already interesting things with social sciences researchers at the institutional level, but I'm happy it happens in France also.
Thank you for representing social scientists in that space. We appreciate it. Fiona, I'm going to turn the question to you on a slightly different tack. So you were so busy for so many years in so many places making these things happen. How did it feel to, I'm going to use the word finally, have the space to pull away, think and reflect and write this kind of a project?
Thanks. And it's a great question. And first of all, I feel like I'm not jet lagged for the first time in 20 years. So that's been a major achievement for me. But in all seriousness, I think without this collaborative way of writing, which I appreciate is probably not the norm for these books, like we literally didn't write separate chapters. We co-wrote and edited and changed, as Dr. Levinson was describing, without that process, I probably wouldn't have written, honestly. So I'm always grateful to my three collaborators on this, because I think without that kind of construct, I might have been like, sure, I have a lot to say, but I don't know, do I really want to do it? So I think for me, this was a particularly useful way of working, even though it was quite lengthy. But I think also it did give me a chance to actually sit back and sort of reflect on what things meant when they happen. I think when you're living in things and you're working through things, you don't always take the time to fully appreciate the consequences sometimes, but also what's been achieved as well. And for me, one of the priorities and one of the reasons I wanted to do this was to kind of put a fact-based analysis and details around some of these events. I think there's a lot of things that have been written about some of these issues over the years that sort of suggest causal relationships that just weren't there. So I wanted to make sure that we were particularly sort of fact-based in our narrative and kind of laying out, this is what happened, and this is what happened, and this is what happened, and here are things to think about. Not this happened, so thus this, which is, I think, is what happens in a lot of these spaces if you're not sometimes privy to some of the conversations behind the scenes. So I was happy to do that. And again, happy to work with this great team of people that really did put a process in place that made it easy for me and useful for me to actually provide my feedback. I hadn't really thought of the way Francesca described it as a constant interview, but yeah, that probably was what it was like in many cases, because we would have these conversations and I'd be like, that's not what happened. That's not what happened. And then I would go back and rewrite and sort of clarify some stuff. So that's a good way to describe it, actually. I'll have to remember that going forward.
Really wonderful, really wonderful. So I'd like to turn to our audience now. So one, I want to thank Professor Dimitri Epstein, who has been here. He's having to take off and leave, so thank you for being here with us. So Dr. Erica Diabasu is asking, is the multi-stakeholder model simply an ideal, with some governments and stakeholder groups having more influence than others?
And if I may, she also precises that in a later comment that her earlier question also relates to issues of exclusion and inclusion. It's just that it's like actually a second part of the same question. So
I did not see that. Thank you. So let's take both of those around inclusion and exclusion. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about the chapter on inclusion, and we talked a little bit about it with the politics around internet protocols and how you engage in that process. So she's asking, so is the multi-stakeholder model simply an ideal, or with some governments and groups having more influence than others, or are there really mechanisms for inclusion in that process? Anybody like to take that?
So I'll say a few sentences about that. And it's really great to see Dr. Basu on the call. So wonderful to have you here. Hello. It kind of reminds me of the famous quote about democracy, which I'm sure I will not get right, but you could correct me, about how it's the best system of governance, and it's the worst system of governance except every other one, right? It's sort of like that. There are problems. We critique multi-stakeholder governance in the book, but there are two questions inherent in what Dr. Basu said. One is the question of the descriptive reality. Is this how it really happens? And then the question that is a little bit more prescriptive about, is it ideal? Is it the way we should have things? And I think that it is actually a descriptive reality, a problematic one, but a descriptive reality about how things happen, because bits and borders do not correspond. Right. The technology crosses borders in ways that transcend national governments, and all of that technology is owned and operated by the private sector. If you think about the private sector, if they were controlling all aspects of internet governance, technical standard setting, interconnection, the distribution of critical internet resources, who should own what domain name, cybersecurity governance, all of this, if they had 100% role, I think we could say that it may not go that well. But conversely, if the governments had that much power over the same kinds of structures of internet governance, that also would not go very well. So this notion of a balance of powers is a very important one. However, that's not how it's done in every aspect of internet governance. There are some areas that are primarily done by governments, like regulation, some regulatory concerns. There are some areas that are privately, done privately, like interconnection. There are private contractual agreements between companies, and then other areas that are really truly multi-stakeholder in the sense that we mean. And I would put ICANN in that category because it involves a lot of different stakeholders. So if you take the totality of all this, that's what we call multi-stakeholder governance, even while it's not the same type of system of governance in each of the categories.
That's super answer. Professor Levinson, go ahead.
I really like Laura's answer, and I just have a two-finger, just a really small, interesting point that I'm finding in the realm of cybersecurity, but we've dealt with this also throughout the book that we wrote together. And that really is the role of power. And even in multi-stakeholder settings or formal multi-stakeholder settings, or also informal multi-stakeholder settings, power is not always equal. And I think in the chapter that we wrote on inclusion and exclusion, we really thought about who has the power to be at the table. And that power includes technical knowledge, which is really, really critical. And I wanted to add one more thing that struck me, and especially as you were just talking, Professor DeNardis, one of the things that I think is in the book, but also I'm noticing in the cybersecurity arena globally today is building on your comment on bits and borders. When there is tremendous technological uncertainty and nation-state governments who really want to have, we deal with these terminologies in the book, digital sovereignty, they are grappling with the how they can actually come up with regulatory frameworks or how to deal with even developing norms, let alone international laws where geopolitics come in. But where there is technological uncertainty, it appears that nation-state governments are, even the more authoritarian leaning ones, might be more willing to accept in appropriate quote unquote roles other stakeholders at the table. But that seems to be, interestingly, when there is a great deal of technological uncertainty. And of course, as pointed out earlier, the technologies cross borders.
Excellent. Really, really interesting. Another question from our audience, Professor Catherine Kleinman says she's cheering for your wonderful new book. So I agree, bravo. I also want to acknowledge her book on women in computing and her movie related to that as well. So thank you, Professor Kleinman. So she says, for our students who may be on the call or watching this, what would you say about the future of internet governance careers? As scholars, or as lawyers, or diplomats, or as technologists, or more? Are there different kinds of careers? What would you say about the career opportunities and prospects for internet governance? Professor Levinson?
I actually was going to turn the microphone over to Fiona Alexander, who I think has a tremendous knowledge of career development in her arena. And then perhaps globally, Professor Musiani might want to comment, and Professor DeNardis as well. But I see tremendous potential. And that last chapter in our book, I hope, will inspire future leaders in our field to think about the many aspects that we cover of internet governance. And remember the definition that Professor DeNardis just shared with you. I see a very bright future, but I really would love to hear, I think, first from Fiona Alexander, her views on this, and then it would be great to hear my other two co-authors' perspectives.
Sure, I'm happy to offer a few perspectives on this. So my short answer would be like, I think the opportunities are only going to grow. When I was a student at American University, actually Professor Levinson was there when I was there. So she was involved in my graduate school education. There wasn't anything on internet governance. I got to have a degree in comparative regional studies and European studies, actually. And now there are degrees in internet governance, and there's scholarly journals about internet governance, and there are books about internet governance. So I think it just speaks to sort of the the main, one of the main points of our book, that the Internet Protocol still survives and is enduring. And as the Internet Protocol continues to endure, and as the Internet sort of continues to impact your life in ways that you can't even imagine, that means there are more jobs that are involved with Internet Protocol policy issues. That means there'd be more need for researchers. There'd be more, so my view is that I only see it growing. I don't see it shrinking. Whether it's, working for your state government or your local government or your national government. There's more and more conversations in the UN and within these institutions themselves. So I think it's a only growing place in terms of issue sets that you might have to look into post-university life.
Excellent. Love that optimism. Professor Musiani, what do you think?
That we can be sociologists in cybersecurity agencies? No, I'm kidding. But no, in all seriousness, I think that we have now completed, there's always room for more, but we are far away from the days in which internet governance was relegated to like technical specific communities. Like there are a lot more diverse publics that are now aware of the extent to which the technical design and building of technological objects and so on entangles with human rights, with values in design, with political strategies that go beyond the original purposes of the technologies, as was the cornerstone of the Turn to Infrastructure book. So I think that the fact that we increasingly see academics entering spaces like institutional spaces, and also social sciences academics entering purely technical, what were formerly purely technical spaces. I think it all speaks to the fact that there are an increasing diversity of profiles, professional profiles that are in the present and the future of the internet governance field, broadly speaking.
Thank you. Anybody else like to answer that?
I'll weigh in, Derek. I was sitting here thinking about the various places where my students have gone once we launch them, and it really is quite amazing. The Department of Justice, the State Department, Meta, defense industries, cybersecurity, contractors, think tanks. Some have gone on to be professors. One recently went to the ITU. So I think these are some of the paths. But I do give students, I guess, 3 pieces of advice about this. One of the pieces of advice is to not be afraid of the technology, and like to consider technical jobs. I can tell you that, I have a couple of engineering degrees. What I learned in engineering school has nothing to do with what I'm studying right now. You have to constantly learn about new things. And I think that applies to all of us, whether a student is in a policy school or a communication school or a sociology school or a computer science school. Not being afraid of understanding and pulling the curtain back in the technologies can really help to get a foot in the door of some places that they may not consider. The second advice is to network. And fortunately, there are many opportunities to do that by joining institutions. There certainly are probably too many of these in the DC area where some of us are right now. But to start to get to know and have the human element of internet governance and learn from people. And then I think the most important advice, though, is that the terminology is tricky. Like, sometimes we're in rooms where someone uses the term internet, and then especially if we're talking about speech issues, the economy, inclusion, and then they suddenly shift to cyberspace if they talk about national security, and they shift to digital in other environments. Now we're talking about artificial intelligence, and they may be talking about the same exact technologies. So the advice is to not just do the keyword search for internet governance, but to look at these more capacious areas of technology that still fall under the purview of some of the issues that we've been talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to add one point, and then I'm going to ask one more question as we wrap up, and then I'll turn it over to Professor Levinson. So the one point I wanted to add to that is one of the interesting things about this multi-stakeholder environment is so many of the processes that we've talked about are open for people to go. Many of us have been to many of these meetings for many years. But for a new person, you can still register and go to the Internet Governance Forum or the Internet Society conferences, and many of them have welcoming spaces for new people. They'll have orientations and work on the terminology and so forth. So I would encourage you not to be afraid to go to some of these meetings and learn and meet with people who've been there for longer. So to end, I'd like to ask you, each of you, to please tell me what was your favorite part of the book? What is your favorite part of the book? And why don't we end with Professor Levinson, because we'll turn it over to you at the end. So why don't we start with Professor Denardis?
I'd have to go with Fiona Alexander's preface. I think that's my favorite part of the book. I think it sets the stage for why we wrote this book, and it sets the stage for the importance of the Internet Protocol. It speaks to the history, and it also hints at the political struggles over it. But I also would be remiss to not say that it just was such a pleasure to work with these intellectuals and these incredible thinkers, and I really learned from them and enjoyed the process of working with them.
Here, here. Thank you. Thank you. I also, now that I have my full interface back, I can see our attendees again, and I want to thank our dean is here, Professor Rachel Robinson. So thank you for being here, Dean Robinson. We appreciate you, your support. Fiona, what do you think is your favorite part of the book?
Well, as I said earlier, I think for me, this the whole experience was unique because I've never written a book before, I never written like this, and anything this long before. So that was a fun experience for me. But again, I really am happy to finally put out into the world some fact-based narratives around some of the histories around some of this that take on a lore of their own. So that was really rewarding for me and something that I wanted to get done. But I think in terms of what I like most about the book is I hope it's accessible. I think by working in academic theory and by working in some case studies and then infusing that with some real world policy practitioner experience, I hope the book is accessible, right? Whether you're an academic or you're a policymaker or a student or where you are in your career. And I hope that's the case. But I'm really optimistic that that last chapter and those 8 points of power and that sort of framing of issue sets will be useful to look at technology as technology evolves over time. So I'm hopeful that we'll see that for a while.
Excellent. I love the optimism. Professor Musiani.
Thank you. Well, I very much second all that has been said about the process itself and the result. Instead of picking like one particular part of the book, I'd maybe like to highlight something that we tried to do in all chapters, and in particular the chapters related to one particular theme, big question and its intersection with the Internet Protocol, which was about finding suitable examples and case studies. So I think that that's one defining feature of the book, the extent to which we insert stories in those chapters to try and make big complex words about technology and policy part of our everyday life. And the most clear one is definitely what Laura mentioned earlier on.
Excellent. Thank you. So it has been a pleasure moderating this process. I see Francesca's lights are turned off now.
Oh my God, they have decided that I have to go.
You have to leave.
Thank
so
you,
Professor
Francesca.
Levinson, can you march us out? We appreciate
I will do
you
so.
being
I
here.
will do so. I would just say I loved every single chapter. The final chapter, everyone must read. It's a great bookend to the brilliant preface at the beginning. And I will say that, Derek, I want to thank you so much for your brilliant moderation. I can't think of a more extraordinary moderator. Thank you. I want to thank my co-authors, even my co-author who is being escorted out of her building in Paris because the security has to go home. Working with these women has been an incredible experience. And I really am going to miss those weekly meetings very, very much. I again quickly want to thank everyone for coming to the webinar. I again want to thank the SIS Office of Research, the SIS Dean, Dean Robinson, and also the SIS Office of Events for their help in putting together in such a wonderful way the webinar and making it captioned and available for anyone to listen to in future years and future generations. So thank you all for joining us. Please consider careers in this field, whether as academics or as professionals. We welcome all of you, and we look forward to comments and emails from anyone with further questions about the book. Take care, everyone, and thank you for being